Okay, I think we're ready to get started. So thanks again for attending today's IMAGINiT Clarity user group, where we'll be covering best practices working with IMAGINiT Clarity and BIM 360. So today's agenda, we have special guests here to go through some best practices using IMAGINiT Clarity and BIM 360, and then we'll cover some additional tips and troubleshooting. We'll have a question session at the end. Then after that question session, we've got Matt Mason, who's going to talk a little bit about what's next for the new IMAGINiT Clarity release, and then we can address any questions after that. So our speakers today include Bill Carney, he's a Senior Associate and Design Technology Leader for DLR Group, Scott Burke, who is our AEC Cloud Services Program Manager, and Matt Mason, the Director of Software Development at IMAGINiT Technologies.
Hi, I'm William Carney, and I'm DLR Group's Design Technology Leader. I'm also part of our R&D studio. I lead DLR Group's Design Technology team, which consists of BIM, reality capture, and recently we added GIS into the mix. So I love my job. It allows me to set the strategy for how our firm leverages technology design. It ranges as broad from how we use Microsoft products to support design process all the way into things like Clarity. I also am in the middle of fall semester teaching digital construction technology for Washington University in St. Louis. And I'm in the middle of preparing for a new course for LinkedIn Learning on ROI for construction technology. So reach out, find me on LinkedIn. Happy to chat at any point. And for today, kind of why I'm here talking is there's been a lot that Clarity has done to help DLR Group with migrating to BIM 360. And so a lot of that's because of COVID-19. So at the end of February, my team had an all hands on deck meeting because of what was happening in our Seattle office. They were starting to experience shutdowns, they were seeing cases on the rise, and we were having very serious conversations because our firm has offices across the entire United States and even around the globe. We actually had offices in Shanghai that were already experiencing what was happening with COVID. So we were very seriously talking about what our plan was if we were going to shut down entirely. DLR Group is a very large firm. We have over 1,200 employees. We're, like I said, we're spread across the globe. So for us to make a move like that was a big deal. And we had gotten the word that we were going to announce 2 weeks from when we had this meeting that we were going to announce that everybody should work from home if they feel they need to. So we needed to have a way to take our over 250 active projects that happen to be on Revit server and get them outside of our firewall so people could have access to them on their laptops. So in December, we bought over 1,000 pack of BIM 360 design licenses, so there was no problem there. The big issue was, could we move that many Revit models in that time? And we started to manually do it on some of the projects to have an estimate of what we were dealing with. And at a minimum, we were seeing like an hour upload time up to BIM 360 to put on, and then we had to relink all the models, and there was just issues there that we were dealing with. So we'd already had Clarity. We were using it for some other projects. We had intent to move it firm-wide, but really we were using it pretty lightly. And we also had it installed on SQL Server Express, which from talking to Matt Mason, it has a limit of about 200 projects. So that was the first problem that we had to overcome. So moving SQL servers isn't very easy, but there is a tool that comes with Clarity that is very helpful. So I put the link for it here. Basically, you unzip it on your Clarity host, and then you run it, and it scans all the projects and recreates them. So having this made us say, okay, let's move to the full version of SQL so we can handle this load of projects. And so we took the time, we set up a meeting, we set up the new SQL server, made it the full version of SQL, and we had to copy over the RAND Revit database and the Clarity Index database. And then this tool did all the rest. So first step, thank you, Clarity, we saved a ton of time. Then the next thing is we had 250 projects on Revit server. And so migrating a project from Revit server up to BIM 360, we found that we had to do it with 2 different projects. We had to have one project looking at the Revit server project and one project looking at the BIM 360 project. So now instead of setting up 250 projects, we have to set up 500. There is a tool in the Clarity admin tools. So if you search in the help menu on Clarity, and I put a link to it here, there's the Clarity project utility. It's not easy to run. I had to ask Matt how to run it, but it's a command prompt tool. So you go, you search, you go into the command prompt, you put in the file path, and then it will bring up some options for setting up projects. So with that, you can go ahead and actually batch create a lot of these projects. So that was helpful for us, and I wanted to point out that that's there in case you weren't aware of it. And then the uploading to BIM 360. So the task upload Revit model from disk, it has to look at a folder location and it'll upload all the files from that folder. The problem with Revit Server is that there's no actual file for you to just upload and run. So we had to have an in-between step, and that's why we had to have the two different projects to do that. So we had two template files that we worked out of, and the Revit Server project, we had a task that was a backup project, and what it would do is pull all the links out and save them into a zip file that we could unzip and have the other file or the other task look at it and upload. So that alone saved a ton of time. We were able to set up this and look at all of our Revit Server projects and have it start pulling the files out of Revit Server so that they could push up into BIM 360. What we ended up doing is making two separate project templates. So we had a BIM 360 project template and a Revit Server project template. And so every time that we made a new project, we duplicate the tasks from these two projects. We just had a list of active projects. We'd go through and we'd make the BIM 360 version and the Revit Server version. We made sure to tag them and name them so we could easily clean them up later. So now we're starting to kind of tackle this task bit by bit, which is pretty good. We hit into more snags than I would have ever guessed. I really thought this would be pretty simple with automating and setting up. It'd be more of coordinating with our teams to figure out how, like, are you in the project this weekend? We're going to do everything this coming weekend, or schedule it and figure out how we did that. And that wasn't the hardest part. There were things just because of BIM 360 that we ran into that were very different. So with that upload file from disk task, you could very easily push a Revit 2020 project right up to BIM 360. It would repath the links, it would recreate the work sets, reapply those, and we had no issues. But it was the previous versions of Revit that we started to run into problems. And so initially, we found that it wasn't recreating the work sets on anything. So we leveraged Dynamo throughout, and that's one of the benefits of Clarity, is that you can set up task sequences, you can run Dynamo scripts on it. And so what we did is we found all the work sets inside of the file, we saved that out to an Excel file, and then we found all of the things in the model and filtered by user work sets. And we just stored a list of the GUID, or the unique ID, of all of the elements in the Revit model that had a user-defined work set on it. And so then in the second script that was the upload, we were able to run a different one that read the Excel file and reapply that work set to all of those elements. So it's a total hack job, but we were able to keep moving and get past our issues, and then reached out to Matt and his team and let them know this was going on. And one of the benefits of doing this with Clarity versus trying to work directly in like Forge API is that Clarity runs outside of Forge. So we were able to have it run and do a script like what we were doing. The Clarity product or task is actually able to save out the information and then reapply all those work sets. So there's things that might not be available with BIM 360's API that we could do because you're working on a computer that's local. So there were just a ton of other weird things that we found. So the lesson of it all is, read the logs, read the task log, read the Clarity log, and then reach out to support@rand.com. Tell them what your issue is, make sure to share those logs, and then look for patterns. And so we'd be successful on a Revit 2020 project, but not on 2019. And so we'd see things like that. One of the weirdest ones that I ran into was that Revit 2019 and Revit 2020, it could find and upload the file to the project. But the previous versions before that, if BIM 360 had never had a file in the project itself, it wouldn't know like what version of Revit it was, and Clarity couldn't even see it to set it up as a project. So I would actually have two like blank files just called project for each version. And if it was a 2018 project, we'd manually upload it to BIM 360, and then Clarity was able to see it and create the project off it and then upload files to it. So it was really, really weird. But stuff like that, you just really have to watch for the patterns of what's working and what's not. try different things, and reading the log gives you little cookie crumbs for how you get there. And then the biggest thing is with Matt and the team at Clarity, they really want to make a good product. So if you're reaching out and giving them this information, they're going and fixing it. And the fix came out after our push, but it came out for anybody else that was trying to do these tasks, and it worked. And I think it was like 10 days or so, they had a new update and a new version where it was working. So just reaching out and working as a community is kind of my message on that. So we moved a ton of models. It's really hard to calculate like the exact time because like, you know, there's the amount of time it took to upload, there's us troubleshooting and doing all these things. So I do like to just kind of anecdotally put this out there of what we generally did, and manually uploading the files, we found that it was at least like an hour per model. The average project count that we had was 3. We had, you know, some projects had like 20 something models. There were several with over 10. But in general, we went with just, you know, 250 projects, an hour per model times 3, 750 hours at $100 per hour. That was like $75,000 worth of time that we saved by scripting through this stuff. And the biggest thing is we were able to, over a weekend, push all these models up so people could work from home and not really even notice. They just had a weekend they weren't able to work. So it was huge for us. And so that's kind of why I'm here today. But some more tips on the tasks of things that we've been learning with BIM 360. There's things that because it's in BIM 360 and it's not on your network that just don't seem to work. So something like a model snapshot, you have to save a file somewhere. And all of ours by default were set to with the central model. So it'd error out because the file couldn't actually be saved there. So you can do the Clarity artifacts as one option, or you can pick a folder path. The problem with the folder path is then you have to put that in for each project. So I showed kind of those BIM 360 and Revit server templates. We like to work from templates. We like to copy and just have the tasks run. So something kind of asking for an improvement idea here would be if we could store a project information parameter, a project folder, or if in the settings for project in Clarity, we could store a network folder location and have that be an option. Then we don't have to change this task ever. We just duplicate it for each project. So we're also looking at, just throwing ideas out there, syncing files with Microsoft Teams. So you can sync your SharePoint folder location, and that shows up at the same spot on all these computers. So if you did that with all of the Clarity task computers, that'd be another option as far as where you could save these things. So we'll see. I'm curious if anybody else does that, and I'd love to get feedback. Another issue that we've run into with BIM 360 is don't rename your projects. You can see there's some differences in here, but the project here, they've got the BIM 360 project and it's the full name, Jubal Island Development. And then if you look in this task, it's looking for project JID. And so somebody had changed it from the abbreviation to the full name. And so the tasks were erroring out. And then we found in the larger BIM 360 downloads, we could actually see that it's seen the full version. So there's something weird there. What we did is just recreate the project and we're fine, but it just made it break. And so it'll say unable to find BIM 360 documents. So when I say read the logs, you really do have to scan these things and they tell you, oh, it can't find it. And then you try to say why, and you start looking and seeing that the names are different. Another one, not similar to that, but re-authentication happens more frequently than I'd like. That's nothing of Clarity, that's a BIM 360 thing. But again, reading the logs, you'll see things like attempting to retrieve all projects, and we'll have hub found, so it can see the hub, but it can't get in there. And so that's something just reading through and thinking, okay, how does this thing work? What you do is you go into the system settings, go to the OAuth settings, and just update your credentials. And you just re-sign in, rerun the task, and usually it fixes. This was another one that we have Navisworks where the BIM 360 upload. So there's things just looking in here that, you know, the post-action tasks. So maybe your task of exporting out something worked, and that's fine, but then we had to upload a file, and so that was authenticated by software licenses. So we look for things like that that tell us when we need to re-authenticate certain things. This is just flat out a random tip because a lot of our tasks will error out and we don't know why, and we're trying to figure out what it is. And so we'll have people just run the same task over and over again. And the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. With this, change the settings and see what works. So like the database export, we have one that's a minimal export. Usually we're trying to get more information, but I've found that certain corrupt elements will cause these things to error out. So if you change the settings and you can get it to successfully work, that can tell you that maybe it's a corrupt element versus your file not working versus authentication or whatever else. So eliminate variables is my word for the wise there. We also use Power BI to try to understand. So now that we have projects in BIM 360, we have projects on Clarity, we have to manage a lot of similar information. And I'll show what we're more doing now or moving towards. By the time we use Power BI and to connect the Clarity table, so this is the Clarity table of projects, there's a B period in front of the ID that's stored for the BIM 360 project. Down here is the BIM 360 project. You can see the same coding there, but no B in front. So if you just drop the first two characters on this list, you can match the two, and then you can not rely on things like name that people might not put in correctly between the two projects, and you can see that you have a matching BIM 360 project to a Clarity project, which is a giant mountain for our team to make sure that we're hitting both, because some projects were already in BIM 360 and didn't have a Clarity project pointing to them. So outside of Revit, these are two last things that all show of what we're doing. So I mentioned like all of the setting up files and doing that. It was brutal. And then you're adding folders. So, you know, it's awesome having BIM 360, but it's also kind of turned my team into a team of administrators when really they're a team of super tech savvy people that can do a lot for the firm. So we're trying to get rid of those tasks. So we're building this portal now. It's pretty much working, but it's very in beta. What we're doing is looking at our accounting data and reading that in. So the employee just types in a number. And so rather than sending an email saying, I want a Revit project, and then waiting for somebody to answer that email and then go set up the project in BIM 360, set up the Clarity project, upload models, blah, 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 blah. This thing will ask them a couple questions. And if we have different disciplines in our accounting system, it'll make those as folders. We'll ask what version of Revit, and then we'll ask them to add the team members to the project. And this will go and start the BIM 360 project. And then it'll go and start the Clarity project looking at the BIM 360 project. It'll make all of these folders, and then it'll run a task inside of Clarity to copy the correct model from our network based on the discipline folder. So we basically pull from the template, drop it in there, reload those links, and that's going to save us a ton of time. The next phase of this is to kind of reverse engineer the BIM execution plan and ask people on uses of how they're going to virtually design their building, and let that be a series of scripts that can apply those things and basically make one template into a ton of templates. So we're excited to see where it goes, but it uses connection to Clarity. It uses connection to Forge API to batch create a lot of the things that are tedious and time sucking for us. Then the other thing that I'm just really proud of, because it's new, hot off the block for us and really possible because of Clarity, is we're automating a ton of what we're doing inside of Navisworks. Our engineering leader mandated that all mechanical projects use clash detection, which for me, I love, because that's something I want to push for our firm. But it's hard to get done. Clash detection is one of those things that it's easy to do, really hard to manage, because like one duct going through 10 walls creates 10 different clashes. And so you have just a lot of grouping clashes and doing things that you're seeing software starting to do. But Dalton Goodwin and our team on this, they set up a series of tasks inside of Clarity to batch create the different Navisworks files. So it's exporting out the NWC, it's compiling them into an NWD that has a bunch of selection sets that are preset as a template based on like the E202 AIA contract document, so that we can go through and say that this is our standard level of clashes and all these things. But then it'll run a Dynamo script that'll open that file and run the clashes and group those together into manageable issues lists. And what he's also doing is saving out point data of where these things are clashing. So all of this is possible because we can just have Navisworks running on the project on a weekly basis, and it's just available So our teams, instead of not doing clash detection because it's hard, are able to just jump in and see this. But then this data allows us to look at the clashes on all of our projects over time and how these things are going and what our trends are, what areas those clashes are happening in. So we hope that we can start looking at that with our construction data to make better decisions and expect, we have this many clashes in design, we should expect this many RFIs on a project, and then maybe we can staff it better. So that's where we're going with it. And to me, it's just really exciting to see in action somebody trying to use machine learning on data that we're creating because we can schedule something. And that's the huge part.
All right, so again, what we're going to be talking about today, or what I'm talking about briefly here, is just some of the deeper dives into the setup and the things you need to do to make sure BIM 360 is actually working with Clarity. So one of the first things you need to do, and this is an Autodesk requirement, is that Autodesk has designed BIM 360 so that it can be open, meaning that it can work with many different third-party applications via the Forge. But in order to do that, you have to give applications the right to come into your system. You have to authorize them. And in this case, it's just Autodesk making sure that you know that a third-party app is interacting with your BIM 360 account. So if you own Clarity, one of the first things you'll need to do is you'll need to go into your BIM 360 account as a full administrator and go to the Apps tab right here and make sure, and then do a search for Clarity and just make sure that you add Clarity to BIM 360 and allow its access. Now, another little caveat here is that there are times when this Apps tab won't show up, and basically the rule of thumb from my understanding is if you have less than 100 seats of BIM 360, the Apps tab is not there. And then what you'll need to do is you'll need to send a request into Autodesk to basically have that done. It's actually in our Clarity help. There's a link there to that help file that would basically say, hey, you have to just tell Autodesk, please turn on my app option, and you just give the Autodesk ID, the name of your account, and the administrator email. And I did that today on an install with Clarity, and actually, halfway through the install, they had sent that email in, and maybe half an hour, 20 minutes later, it was authorized, and during the install, we were able to set it all up. So it was pretty quick. So that's that first step. Before anything can happen with BIM 360 with Clarity, you just have to let Clarity in, if you will. The next thing here is the OAuth settings. And OAuth, I think it's a program, a setting, or a phrase, or maybe it's an Autodesk one. I'm not exactly sure where that term came from, but I know it's something that we didn't make up, where it's a kind of a standard programmer naming nomenclature. And this is just where you're telling Clarity what authorization are you going to use to access BIM 360. So in this case, let me pop Clarity open so you can kind of see it, in that environment here. So in Clarity, as a administrator, I'd be able to go to my server tab here, and under settings, right down here, I would have my OAuth settings. And this is where you would do or put in the authorizations for any of the plugins or third-party cloud services that Clarity can interface with. So you can see here, we can now interface with BIM 360, BIM Track Box, Dropbox, Google Drive, Microsoft Office Procore. So you can go in here and add in any credential that you need to access those sites. So here you can see that I have this authorized to myself. You can have multiple credentials in here that you would choose from when you're creating a project, and I'll show you where that is too. And at the bottom here, there's even a place you put in an email. So if Clarity for some reason loses this authentication, the token expires, as they call it, then and it's not able to renew it, then we can set it up so that it will send an email to the individuals who have this information, and they can re-enter it. So that's that first thing we have in Clarity there, to allow it to connect to the BIM 360 environment. So one, you have to allow Clarity into BIM 360. Then you tell Clarity which credential you're going to be using to access the projects. And if this is the credential you're using, the important part is that this credential, whatever it may be, must be, of course, on any BIM 360 project that you'd like to use in Clarity. It has to be kind of like that virtual user. What most people are doing here is on the task server side here. So if we kind of go back into what we're going through here, on the task server, you want to set up the task servers to basically log in with that same credential. So, and we also want to have on the task computers, the task servers as they are, but they're really just task computers. We also want the desktop connector installed because that will actually keep it logged in, and that's the key here. And then of course that allows that BIM 360 connector there, which is also critical for any of your projects that are using the connector for linking non-work shared files or AutoCAD files and such. In order for the Clarity task server to work, it too has to have access to those same files, right? So the desktop connector is also needed just so Clarity can get to those non-BIM 360 design but linked in files. Now, with the new way that Autodesk has the licensing with named users, and this is an important consideration, because of that, each task server has to have assigned to it its own unique identification, its own user ID. So each machine, a lot of companies will call it, task server 1, task server 2, task server 3, create an Autodesk ID for all three of those, and assign a design license and assign a Revit license to those Autodesk IDs. And then, as I mentioned before, back in Clarity, under the OAuth settings, you might have all three of those logins to the various task servers. And when you create a project, you tell the project which task server to use, which will have the appropriate login to get into the BIM 360 account. So those are other important things that you have to consider. So because Autodesk has gone to this name user methodology here, it just complicates this a little bit in the fact that you have to understand that each task server, which is like that virtual person that's running the task for you, has to have its own license of BIM 360 design so that it can get into your project. And just like any other user, whatever task server you're using, let's say you have 3 task servers, you'd make sure that the identity you're using for task server 1 is on the project that you'd like task server 1 to work on. Then you could have another project and assign it to task server 2, and have another project and assign it to task server 3. Or you can have all 3 projects, or as many as you want, assigned to one task server. But that's the key, that it has to all be using that same Autodesk ID. So that's why under OAuth settings 1, we have the ability to add in additional authorizations. Then on the task servers themselves, each task server has to be assigned one of those authorizations that you've created and assigned a license of Revit and BIM 360 design. So that's the other part. So on the task servers themselves here, let's open it live here, we need to make sure here that you're putting in the appropriate user, one of these 3, let's say, that's in the main OAuth settings in the Clarity host. So I might, and again, for simplicity, most firms will give it, kind of an easy name like task server 1 at your company's email address, or Clarity task server 1, something like that, so that it's easy to identify them. That way you would always put, if you know you're going to be using task server 1 on a project, you use task server 1's identity and add that in. So each task server has to have its own identity here, and by having the desktop connector installed on each task server, that keeps this identity logged into both Revit and, of course, BIM 360 for the Clarity task servers to work. So that's just an important consideration that you have to remember that. So now that we have 3 task servers with their own 3 unique Autodesk IDs, we have 3 Autodesk IDs to choose from, let's say, inside of Clarity. When you're creating a project, and I'll just call this test here, and I'll call it BIM 360. Then down at the bottom, you have to, of course, specify whether or not you're using the old Collaboration for Revit, which is the old team site, or of course, BIM 360 Next Gen. Then here, you need to pick a hub that you're working on. So I am working on our own hub here. If I was working with an outside firm, you can use your own Clarity on a firm that's another firm that is hosting BIM 360. But if that's going to be the case, that other firm, you would have to request that they also allow Clarity into their BIM 360 site. And then you would have to ask them to add one of your Clarity task server licenses, essentially, or not really a task server license, but a task server identity that's in BIM 360 to their project as well. That way, Clarity will be able to access a project that's not within your own hub. So it really is just that 2 extra steps. 1, let Clarity into your associates or your consultants hub, and then 2, add your Clarity task server user, one of the 3, to the project that they're hosting is what you would need to do for outside projects. And technically, that's the same thing you do for your own internal projects. You allow Clarity into your hub. You allow a user into that the Clarity task server is assigned to the project you'd like to use the task server on. And that's what I'm doing here. So the first step, of course, is I go into my hub or my outside hub. I would pick a project that I want to connect to. And this is the important part. There's no way for Clarity to, at this point, to know what version of Revit that project is. So it's extremely important that when you're creating a BIM 360 project, that you know what version of Revit you're working on. So if that project's in 20, then you have to pick 20 out of the list. And I know it is for this particular project is a Revit 2020 project. Now that I've selected the project, again, if I had multiple authorizations, meaning different users that would log into BIM 360, there would be another option here where I could actually pick which login are you using to access a project. And then only the projects assigned to that particular login, that identity, would show up here. Because I only have one identity, it doesn't give me that option because it's irrelevant, because I only have the one option. But I'd have an extra setting here if I had more than one. Then right here, after I pick my project, I've set the version. It's also important, of course, that you select a folder, subfolder. And this is also good because this lets you know that if I go in here and I don't see the folders I need, odds are that the identity that you're using does not have rights to the folder that you need to see. So that's another good check here. So I know that my identity in this case is an administrator on the BIM 360 project. It's not necessary for the Clarity identity, the task server identity, to be an administrator on the project you were assigned to, but it does need read-write access, of course, into any of the folders where you're keeping your Revit models. So here I can navigate now into my project folders, and just like with the file-based one, you always want to pick the lowest folder you can in the tree, but low enough or high enough that it sees all the Revit files. Unless, for instance, I only want to see the architectural file, then I can pick the architectural folder. But if I wanted to see models in the architectural, the MEP, and structure, then I want to pick the upper level here, which is just my project design models, and I'll hit select. So now that's the folder it's going to use to look in subfolders for Revit models. Another important thing here is in most cases, you're going to want to use the live model, right? Where that's the model you want Clarity to work on. Now, if you don't want to do that, you can say, no, use just the published models and only see the published ones. But in this case, I do want to use live models. Also, especially when you're using live models, you probably want to hide the shared consume folders because you don't want those models being picked up as well, because they will be if you don't. If you have this set to no, it will also see the models that are in the shared and or consume folders if you have access to them, which you usually don't want to have happen when you're using a live model. So again, that should be set to yes for live model especially. Additionally here with BIM 360, include uploaded models. So let's say someone just manually drags and drops a file into BIM 360 or simply a Revit file that is not work shared or using BIM 360 design. If you check that off, you can also see those in Clarity and run tasks on those files as well. So in this case, maybe you have an uploaded model that's like a regular consultant is sending you the standard way, like you were doing with Dropbox, right? Except that you can use the desktop connector in your model to connect to the non-work shared models or to AutoCAD files or any of those things. So this just allows the manually uploaded Revit files to be used in a Clarity project. So in other words, technically, as long as you're not editing any of the files, you could have Clarity work on just a BIM 360 docs project, and it would just see the uploaded models, and that's what you'd be using here, and there would be no live models. You'd maybe just tell it to use the published model instead. And that way you could use BIM 360 Clarity actually on just a BIM 360 docs project. So that's the key here. Now, another important thing is, say I go in here and I create a project and I notice I can't see my project in here. Well, it may be that you just created the project, and Clarity probably scans the BIM 360 project only twice a day to see if there are any new projects. So if you just created a project, all you have to do is hit the refresh button here, and that will make Clarity go and check your BIM 360 hub right now to make sure all the files are there, or it'll scan it for any new additional projects. So if you don't see your project and you just created it, just hit the refresh button, wait about 30 seconds, recreate it. It should show up then in the list, and then you can use it. So again, I would create the project. It's now seeing the files that are in that BIM 360 environment and reading those out. And when I go into my filtered files here, and I go in and say filter specific models, you can see these are the files that it found in there. And I have some files in here I don't want included. So I don't want this master coordination model in there. I don't want, one of these other ones, this coordinate model here. That's my coordinate model. So I'm only going to pick just the models I want to be included. So my architectural, my MEP and structure, the other folders, the other subfolders, I don't need to include those models in this Clarity project. So when I go back to Clarity Home here, eventually it'll filter it, and then I will just see the versions of the Clarity models that I'm using. It'll show you the version, but you're really picking that. It's not determining that for you. So that's something that you've kind of gone in and told it what version of Revit it is. So that's step one, is you use an identity to identify the project you'd like to use. You bring it in here. Step two is that you would have to go to your tasks here and go to authorizations. And this is where you control what authorizations the project's using. For your other tools, you notice though the BIM 361 can't be adjusted here because that's part of the project. Just wanted to point that out. The key here though is that you'll have to use selected task servers, and you need to make sure you use the task server that's using the same authorization here. So if this is the authorization I'm using, I have to use a task server that has that same authorization in it. So this is really just one server here, but let's say these were two servers. This is authorization 1, this is authorization 2. I would make sure I'm using authorization 1. So that's the important part, that you're picking a task server that has the correct BIM 360 authorization. So that's the other aspect of it. So once that's done and you've told it what BIM 360 identity to use, you've created your project, you've told it what task server to use, that's all working fine. When you're managing your tasks and you're creating tasks here, this is important as well, like was mentioned earlier. So when I go in and you add a task, and let's just say a common one, of course, would be PDF or something like that. The key here is for the post task actions, that when you come in here and say you want to post a file also into BIM 360, right? So you're going to print a PDF set, and then you'd like it to upload the PDF after it creates it into a folder within your BIM 360 site. So right here, one of my post task actions then will be BIM 360 upload. It lets me pick the appropriate hub. It lets me pick one of the projects that the authorization I'm using has access to. And this is probably the most important part here, is that once you go in and you tell it what folder to go into, so you can navigate through the folders, which is nice. So I can go into my project documents, actually is where I want to go here. And I want to just throw things into my PDFs. Oops, sorry, clicking too fast here. PDF plan folder. What people don't do is they don't test it. So once you pick the folder and hit OK, well, did you test it? Are you sure you have read-write access to that? So I'm going to hit edit here again to edit that setting that I made. And what I want to do here is, before you leave this, always hit the test button. Give it a second, and it's going to come in here, and it says right here, a valid configuration is available. In other words, the folder is successfully located and it's working. So you know this path's working. I would say that this is the #1 cause of support tickets for Clarity in general, is that people aren't hitting the test button, so that whatever folder they're uploading something into, whether it be BIM 360 or a local file share, quite often in the local file shares, it's misspelled or they don't have access rights to a folder. And the same with BIM 360 here, they may not have the proper read-write access to the folder for the Clarity service account that you're using to access that project. So always, always hit that test button to make sure that it actually can reach the folder. That's going to guarantee you that when the post-task action happens, it very least has read-write access to it, and it should be fine. So that's another important kind of troubleshooting thing, that you're using the appropriate credential and you're testing the folders for, basically what you're uploading things into. And again, as also mentioned before, when you're looking at any of your errors, like maybe why something didn't complete, so let me just pick a longer date range, read these logs, because they're actually, in many cases, not exactly just programmees, right? They're actually in, a language. I'm gonna see if I see update here. I need to do some other things on my server here, but I'd be able to see, completed tasks here. That's because I'm not in a, let me just go to this project here. That would help. One that actually has tasks that ran in it. Here we go. All right. So let me go ahead here to completed tasks and go back in time a couple of months here. There we go. And I'll update that. So these are all the tasks. Let's look at ones that failed for some reason. So I'm going to filter that by error. So some of these here is unable to open the Revit file. In this case, it couldn't get to the folder because I forgot to set the credential for BIM 360, or I think it had expired or something like that. So again, this is just a good place to go to, read these things, read the checks here just to make sure you understand what's going on. Open it. It will usually tell you what it couldn't do. It couldn't get into something, whatever. If at that point you still can't fix it, just hit send to IMAGINiT. Put as much information in here as you can. That will help us troubleshoot this very quickly and either create a new support case or, of course, attach it to a support case that you've already started with a number, or create a new support case. But again, this is key. Just don't say I'm having problems printing. Please put in exactly what you're doing, all the pertinent information. That will just help us pre-research it. So when we contact you, we're probably already going to have a solution for you, and that can really help us help you. So just recommend that you do that.
Yeah, so thanks everybody for joining. I just wanted to say a couple words about Clarity 2021.1, which is upcoming. I did a more in-depth demonstration and discussion of this a couple days ago. There's a recording of that somewhere for people who are interested in participating in the beta. And then right now our timing is that this will get released somewhere around November 15th to about a week later, depending on how it goes. But just to give you a preview, if you didn't make that previous meeting about what we've got going on there, the topics that we're hitting or the themes that we're hitting, there's a lot around security. There's a variety of things around task automation and being more flexible. There's a couple things on BIM 360, a little bit on the Clarity client and reporting, and then we're really excited about some of the data things that we're offering. And just to go quickly through it, so on the security side of things, for people who have certain projects that have higher security than other projects, we've got some more fine-grained control over or rules about who's allowed to automatically see these things. We've got more control over where you can browse within the system, and when we offer a browse, can people access the server drives or other things, or can we lock them down to more specific things like the P drive, or however you want to name sort of favorite locations for people to go to. We have things like being able to disable post-task actions that you don't want people using, that sort of thing. We have a variety of new features around security rules where we can have control over things like, for people who are reluctant to have just kind of open scripting being run within Clarity, we have the ability to lock down and say that that things running in a particular context might be required to run out of certain approved folders. So that limits which scripts can actually get run. And then we also have the ability to go in and change who is actually executing the task, whether that's an inside of Revit task or even on a Windows task side of things. You can go in and specify that that rather than whoever my regular task server is running as, I want to change in this case, and I want to run as an alternate user. So it's an interesting and very complicated sort of setup. I don't know how many firms will take advantage of it, but we did want to offer that up for the people that did have sort of security concerns about the fact that the sort of Clarity service account running on the task server, is a relatively high privileged sort of user. But you might not want them to be assigned to every project, and you might have other concerns about it. So we think our new mechanism to change who we're actually launching as and executing as will help address that for people who have concerns about that. You can even set it on a specific task. Let's see, other fun things. We are opening up tasks to be a little bit more flexible. So if you do have a task that gets kicked off by hand, let's say it prints off 100 sheets and does a good job at it, but you've changed exactly 2 sheets and you'd like to just print those 2, you have the ability to say that when someone kicks off this task manually, that they have the ability to go in and override which sheet set to print, or the PDF file name, or whatever you'd like to allow them to override. And this is things that are now possible to change either inside of the web environment. Inside the web, you can click it and it'll prompt you for these things that you're allowed to override, but also inside of the Revit environment. So you can kick things off and override things inside of Revit. Someone mentioned something about tasks or doing the same thing over and over again is insanity. We now have a check that you can turn on that says if someone's configured a task that just keeps on failing over and over again, that you have an option to either just nag them about fixing that task and they'll just let it keep running, or even to go in and disable them if it's failed more than X number of times in a row. We've got some cleanup on how tasks can look like PDFs. We've got new tasks like the model checker, being able to run the BIM interoperability tools model checker for Revit. We've got some BIM 360 enhancements to be able to push different attributes that are either in Revit or in other systems like ProjectWise, and push those into custom attributes like what you can define inside of a folder in BIM 360. So let's see, we've got some new reporting around your Revit sessions. If you're using the Clarity client and you'd like to use that as a tool to keep track of who's actually using Revit out there in your environment, are they using BIM 360? Are they using it based on the IP address? Are they using it from home? Are they using it in the office? There's a variety of questions that people have thought that Clarity could answer. And so we've upgraded the Clarity client to be able to supply those answers by just sending in some basic usage information at the end of every Revit session. And then finally, the external OData links. This is a new feature that we have. It basically is trying to drop some of the obstacles involved in getting your data into another system like Excel or like Power BI. And to do that, you can just go in as a project coordinator and get the external reporting link for your project. So given this link, inside of Power BI, you can just go paste this in as an OData feed within Power BI, and you'll have a live link to the data that's inside of Clarity. No setting up of SQL permissions or access or those kinds of things. And once you've got that, inside of something like Power BI, you have access to a bunch of sort of the most commonly used tables in our database. You have access to reports. You have access to the model metrics, so you can do things like that. Your sort of simple data reports, but you can also, we have a new, for this new shape map format within Power BI. It's sort of a brand new technology called shape map. We have a new exporter called the Topo JSON exporter, which will go in and generate maps for the different levels in your project, and you can tie that data in. You can come in and say, show me the common department or the outreach department or administration and link that data in. You can even get in and say, I want to export the location of different families. So if you wanted to know where is the furniture within each level, that's the kind of thing that you can do. So we're excited that we're making it easier to just say, get me the OData feed, and that's all you need to be able to start using this either in Excel or in Power BI, and just sort of reducing the obstacles to letting people leverage the data that you have inside of Clarity.